Good afternoon or good morning, everybody, depending where you are in the world. And thank you for joining us for today's the fifth session in the Adults with Developmental Disabilities series brought to you by Kevin Fitzgerald. And this session is not just going through the motions, and during today's presentation, you will have the opportunity to earn one CEU if you had already purchased in the store. And if you didn't purchase already, don't worry. You'll be able to overnight tonight or even partially in the morning. I will be analyzing all of the data from today's webinar in the morning for your CEU certificates so you can receive those instructions by lunchtime tomorrow. And the way that you'll earn that CEU is by answering a couple of poll questions that will be popping out throughout the presentation today. If you've come to the other 4 sessions in the series, then you know exactly what to expect. And if not, then I will go into further detail when the polls come up. I did send an email letting you know that the handouts will be distributed tomorrow after the presentation. But if you want to follow along while you're here with us now, they are available in the control panel for your download now. Otherwise, wait for that email tomorrow morning and they'll be in your inbox. I think, oh, and if you have any questions for content during the webinar itself, feel free to put your questions in the questions part of your control panel, and we will be breaking every so often to answer those. But I think that's all I have to say for now, so I'm going to shut down, well, my camera, not completely, and turn it over to Kevin.
Thank you so much, Marissa. Once again, I want to say to those that are attending, I'm humbled and honored once again. Some of you have been attending all the series. We're becoming old friends and we don't even know it. But I really appreciate the opportunity to get to speak to all of you. And one of the reasons why I decided we should talk about functional behavior assessments in the title, and tongue in cheek, I think a lot of you can relate to this. There's a little bit of cynicism and sarcasm going on here when I say not just going through the motions. And the reason why I titled this webinar that is, quite honestly, I found myself, as I get a little bit older and a little bit lazier, kind of going through the motions. when I used to be real diligent when I did my FBAs, when I started doing them a number of years ago. But now I find as I get older and I think wiser, I'm actually getting dumber because I'm forgetting a lot of the things I used to do and should be doing when conducting a comprehensive functional behavior assessment, or FBA. So today's content is really getting us back, I think, to the roots, getting us back to our base of what I think a comprehensive FBA is supposed to include and look like. So this is not only information to share with you, it's really information to remind myself about how I'm supposed to be doing them. Now, the first question, of course, is what kind of assessment methods or procedures are we using, right? There's these tried and true assessment devices that have been out there for a number of years. We're all familiar with them. The MASS, the Motivation Assessment Scale, the FAST, the Functional Assessment Screening Tool, QABF, questions about behavioral function. So the first question is, what types of indirect assessment instruments have we used? And the key word here is, how reliable are they? Because I've heard quite a bit of rumblings that a lot of these older assessment devices that we use for indirect assessments are not all that reliable. And that's been my experience too. It is what it is. If that's what we have available to us, we have to use it. But hopefully someone out there in the world is working on coming up with something a little bit more reliable than the old school devices that I typically tend to use. Number two, I wanted to throw in here, just because I'm guilty of this. I find myself doing this a lot. And I'm trying to remind myself not to do this anymore. We oftentimes overlook talking or interviewing the person in an effort to determine the origin of problem behavior. So here I am running around talking to support staff, caregivers, family members, guardians, about why the heck does this person that we're focusing on do what they do? And in the process of doing all of that, I'm neglecting to ask the person who's actually exhibiting the problem behaviors. Kind of like, that's kind of stupid. they should at least have a chance to weigh in as to why they think they do some of the things they do, right? So as it's just a reminder, not only to you, but to myself, that if we have a person who's functioning at the mild, borderline, even moderate level of intellectual disability, and I'm not saying that everybody has good insight. I'm not saying that everybody can identify and articulate what the reasons why they do what they do are. In some cases, I'm not sure I can articulate some of the reasons why I do what I do. So I can certainly relate to that. But they at least should have an opportunity to have a good conversation in a forum where they feel comfortable divulging as best they can why they do some of the things they do, if in fact they can help us identify those reasons. Third point is, how many direct observations have we done? Across settings or environments, right? People behave profoundly differently depending upon what setting they're in. I behave differently at home than I do when I go to work, just like you do. So the setting and the environment profoundly impact our behavior. So if I've only done a couple of indirect assessments, direct assessments if I'm doing direct observation, and I've done a couple of assessments of the person at the residence that they live in with 24-hour staffing, and I did a couple of those assessments at about the same time of the day, while the same activities were going on, then really, that's not a lot of broad-based information that I'm capturing, right? I'm looking at a very finite moment in time, and I'm not sure that's going to give me the more broad perspective of the person's behavior, if that's all I've done, or if I've confined myself to just a couple of observations in the same environment at the same time. So I know we're all under a lot of time constraints. I know we all have a larger caseload than we'd like to have, but I think doing a comprehensive FBA is so important that it deserves more of our time and more of our diligence than just to kind of do a quick and dirty FBA, which I said when I started the presentation quite candidly, I find myself guilty of quite a bit. Have we taken into account reactivity? So we all know the phenomenon of reactivity in applied behavior analysis is simply that a person's behavior can profoundly change as a function of knowing that they're being directly observed. So even though you try to do these observations, presumably as discreetly as we can, I'm a relative stranger to these folks. They don't see me all the time. So what's he doing here? What's he looking at? Why is he sitting over there watching me? All of that can profoundly impact the way a person presents as we're trying to get an impartial, objective observation in place. So don't forget about reactivity and the impact that can have. Who has been interviewed? What is the relationship to or with the individual? How long have they known them? So part of the problem during this pandemic and the incredible staff turnover that we're experiencing at an all-time high is that a lot of staff don't know these folks that well and haven't known them for that long a period of time. So if I'm giving the manager of a residence a mass and a fast to fill out on the individual's behalf, and they've been there for 3 months, well, that's not really great information to go on. I'll take what I can get, but I'm not happy about it. So, the information that you get from the informant is directly contingent upon how long they've known them and what capacity, how much time they've spent actually working with the person. So that's a consideration. How long have they known them? Here's one that you got to be aware of. Do they have preconceived opinions or hypotheses? How many times have I, and I'm sure many of you, walked into a situation to try to assess a behavioral problem, and I start to talk to the staff, and before I can even open my mouth, they say, "Oh, he just wants attention," right? That 90% of the time, that's what I get. And I say, well, that might be true, but there's a process we have to go through to determine if the person is actually doing this well, you don't even have to bother. I know it's about attention. So, just give me whatever you want, but it has to do with attention. So again, if we're trying to be impartial, objective, unbiased, that's not a good start. So, these preconceived notions where people think they know these people so well, they know why they do everything that they do, that's a bit of a pitfall. We have to be careful. And I'm not trying to be disrespectful here. These people do know these folks very well, but let's let the process run its course. Does the clinician have preconceived opinions, hypotheses? What do I have a bias going in? Sometimes I do. I need to check that at the door. Let's talk about some of the biological, medical, and predisposing factors that I believe need to be taken. This is not just about what the person does in the moment, and then we look at the environment and go, oh, that happened over there, so that's why the person responded that way. I wish it were that simple. And behavior analysis, at some level, tries to make it that simple, but I think human behavior is much more complex than that. I wish it were that simple because our jobs would be a heck of a lot easier, but I don't think it is that simple. So some of the other factors that I think we're obligated to take into account are, do they have some type of syndrome that can have a behavioral expression or influence? Has this been considered? There's many syndromes out there. Some common syndromes, some very rare. Down syndrome, very common syndrome. But there are literally dozens, if not hundreds, of Creutzfeldt syndrome, Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, Lesch-Nyhan syndrome. I mean, there's a bunch of them, and so I don't know them all. But when I see that a person's been diagnosed with some kind of a syndrome, and I can't immediately identify either the physical or the cognitive or intellectual manifestations of that, I immediately start doing my homework, what I call my homework. And then I look to see if that might be contributing to the behavioral expression of, it might be an influence as to why the person is doing what they're doing. So be aware of that. Have we definitively ruled out any health or medical factors or conditions, which could be partially, if not solely, responsible for a change in behavioral presentation? I've said before, for those of you that have followed me, the reality is that health and medical services for the folks that we are privileged to support are, generally speaking, substandard and inadequate. That's not to just condemn the entire health and medical field. I'm not doing that. I'm simply saying that our folks are very complicated and very complex, and it takes very sophisticated people, I believe, to be able to evaluate and analyze them to determine why they do what they do. So as we try to be more scientific in our approach, some of the physicians and neurologists and endocrinologists that I take people to aren't operating at that same standard or that same premise. So we have to be aware of that. So when people say, when I say, and one of the first things I say is, oh, have you ruled out any health or medical factors? And the staff say, oh yeah, but that we took them to their PCP, everything's fine. Okay, well, I don't know about you, but I can be a bit of a pain in the neck. I go, I want to see that consult. What exactly did they do? Did they run any tests? Did they do any blood work? Did they, I got a million questions. And most of the time when I start probing and asking those questions, you know what I find? Stuff hasn't been done. So don't tell me you ruled it out when you didn't even rule it out because you didn't do what you needed to do to rule it out. Okay, enough of that. Do we know the mental health histories of immediate family members? And is there any evidence the individual may be having some type of psychiatric mental health issue or problem? So here's what we know. We know that at least 50% of people with an intellectual disability will develop some kind of legitimate mental health disorder condition at some point in their lifespan. And I think that's probably an underestimation. We know that there's a high probability of genetic predisposition for certain psychiatric disorders, depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. So if we know something about the person's family history and the likelihood that that person may have a similar type of affliction from a mental health perspective, that should be at least considered and factored into the whole totality of us doing our FBA. Let's do poll question number 1, please, Marissa.
Okay, everybody. So informants, relatives, and staff persons oftentimes have preconceived notions regarding the function of figures. True or false? Awesome. As many of you know from previous sessions, this is what the poll questions will look like. It will just pop up right on your screen and you can put your answer in the multiple choice interface itself. Otherwise, if you have any trouble with that interface, then you can put your answer either in a Word document or the body of an email, and that will perfectly suffice for your participation. But if you need that CEU credit, just please make sure that you do answer these poll questions. We need them for your participation grade, not so much for the accuracy, but we do need them if you want that CEU. So I will shut this down in 3, 2, and 1. All right, so it looks like 99% said true.
Oh, I
1%.
wanted 100 so bad. 99, not bad. Yeah, the answer is true. I just talked about how we all tend to have these biases going in. So thank you, Marissa, for that. Do we have any questions that have been posed yet?
Yeah, we actually do have a couple. So
All right.
what's your preferred method in direct assessment?
My preferred method is really something I can't do a lot of. I like to have multiple observations of the individual at different times of day, in different settings, preferably. I love to know how people behave when they go home. I'd love to be able to observe that, because oftentimes people that go home with family members, as most of you know, can behave profoundly differently than they do when they're in their 24-hour staff living residence. I trust my eyes and ears more than anybody else's, and I'm not trying to be boastful when I say that. I'm saying that in all modesty. I'm like radar when I go in to do a direct assessment. I'm aware of the noises, I'm aware of the temperature, I'm aware of who's in the room, I'm aware of what people are being asked to do, I'm aware of what activities the person is engaged in. It's like an all-encompassing kind of broad-based evaluation and observation. But you know, I trust my own eyes more than I trust anybody else's. So I like to. The problem has been for me, as I think it has for many of you, we're stretched so damn thin. I mean, let's just be honest, that we're doing quick and dirty FBAs. I said it. It's not a sin. It's a fact. Most of us are guilty of doing quick and dirty FBAs that I don't think we've given the person enough effort on our part, which means we're coming up with erroneous functions of behavior. That's the bottom line. Next question, Marissa.
Alrighty, so sometimes other professionals think behavioral interventions will fix it, when in reality it's mental health. How do we combat that and get through to a psychiatrist who firmly believes it's not OCD, for example, and further investigate what's warranted?
Yeah, it's a good question. So my experience is, for what it's worth, is that there's usually a synergistic kind of treatment approach. So many people with developmental disabilities have a mental illness, in my opinion. Depression is the overall, and you've heard me talk, if those of you who joined me in the other series about personality disorders, which I think are grossly underestimated, which is tough to medicate. But you know, I would advocate in that case, just advocate for an empirical trial of low dose medication to address OCD and see if it impacts the behavior. So for obsessive compulsive disorder, the medications of choice are usually Prozac, Anafranil, or fluvoxamine. So I would say to the psychiatrist who thinks it's all behavior, right? But this has been the argument for years. The doctors say it's behavioral, the behaviorists say it's medical, and this has been the ongoing battle, and it continues. I would suggest, you know, it's not going to hurt anybody. It might actually help. Put them on an empirical trial of medication, carefully document the symptoms that you are looking to provide some relief for, and see if you get any efficacy. That's how I would approach it. All right, I'm going to continue. Plenty of time for questions later on. Communication. So, you know, I harp on this constantly, and I'm never going to stop. Since virtually all behavior serves a communicative function, have we carefully and comprehensively evaluated the person's expressive, communicative skills and abilities? And the vast majority of people I am privileged to become involved with, we have not done what I just described. We just haven't done it. People have virtually no expressive communication. So what is the default? They're going to communicate via their behavior. And you may not like what it is they do, but it's very effective, but not very appropriate or responsible in the way they're communicating. But if that's all they got, then we haven't aggressively, diligently, comprehensively, creatively approached their communicative deficit. You think you're going to change it? Good luck with that. So this is a big problem in the field, that a lot of people that can't expressively communicate, we've accepted the fact that they're limited in that regard. And I believe that all people can communicate better than they are, with training and reinforcement and persistence and lots of things. So never give up on that communication contribution, because it's major, it's massive. Have alternative methods to introduce and enhance expressive communication been introduced, trialed, reinforced? Now, how many times do I get involved with a person and I say, how do they expressively communicate? Well, they point. If they want a drink, they pull you to the fridge. And I go, okay, have you ever tried object icons, PECs, augmentative communication devices, maybe an iPad? Have you done anything like that? Yeah, we tried that and it didn't work. I get that a lot. That doesn't sound very convincing to me. Okay, who tried it? How was it set up? What kind of thought went into it? How persistent were you? So the person got an iPad for a couple of days and they never touched it or used it. So then you decided they weren't going to utilize that device to communicate? Really? You're going to give up that quickly on something that's so profoundly important? Geez, I hope not. I'm like a pit bull when it comes to this stuff. I don't give up because it's so important that that person have another more appropriate, sophisticated way to expressively communicate. You can't just throw your hands up and go, oh, well, it's not okay. I want you to think about this last point, because what I'm talking about here are the main hypotheses of function that ABA has taught us. Remember, if a person can appropriately communicate that they want attention, or they don't want to do a particular task avoidance, or they don't want to be in a particular setting, location, or they want some particular object or item, receiving attainable, then they likely would not be exhibiting the behaviors where you're trying to reduce or eliminate. So all of those core hypotheses of behavioral function that are allegedly, I'm using that word deliberately, the core reasons as to why our people do what they do, they can all be profoundly impacted, and in some cases alleviated, by giving them more effective communication capabilities or strategies. So what do we know about the social history, or what I'm calling the internal state of the individual? Well, this is what I mean by that. We are all products of our environments and collective experiences. Do we truly have a thorough understanding of the person's previous placements? Sometimes this is part of the record, sometimes nobody has a clue. Sometimes people say, well, I don't know where Joe lived before he came to us. All I know is he's been here for 10 years. And he was 32 years old when he moved in, and now he's 42. And this is what we know from the 10 years that we've observed Joe. Well, that's great. But you know what? Some of the stuff that Joe experienced for the first 32 years of his life, whether you like it or not, or want to acknowledge it or not, may be profoundly impact the way he's behaving today. So don't discount it. Don't think it doesn't matter, because it does, just like it does for all of us. We are all products of our upbringing. We are all products of what we've been exposed to. There's no denying it. There's no getting away from it. Significant life events. What's happened in the person's life that might have profoundly impacted their mental health, their behavioral presentation, their attitude, their personality? I'm not going to get personal, but there's things that have happened in my life that have profoundly impacted who I am today, and I'm sure there are for all of you. So let's not forget that those events that shaped us and molded us positively and negatively into who we are today also take place with the people that we're privileged to support. Does a person have meaningful relationships? That's a real important question. Because a lot of our people don't. A lot of our folks don't. Many do. Some have very involved, loving, caring family members. Many don't. A lot of our people that live in 24-hour staffed residences, particularly during the pandemic over the course of the last year, they haven't been able to go out with friends. They haven't been able to do things that they normally would have done. Their relationships have been profoundly impacted, not only being able to form new ones, but maybe the erosion of previous relationships. Don't you think that can impact behavioral presentation? I sure do. And last but not least, any evidence of any trauma experiences, right? Trauma-informed treatment now is all the rage. And it's all the rage because we're taking an honestly retrospective look at the people that we support and what they've gone through in their lives. And there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of abuse and neglect, whether you want to acknowledge it or not, it's a fact. So all of that unfortunate cumulative history can affect profoundly the way a person behaves and responds and reacts. And then I'll throw in there, and though not traditionally considered as particularly relevant and or important factors, I respectfully disagree. Now, keep in mind, I took all the behavior analytic coursework over a decade ago. But you know what they didn't talk about or seem to care a whole lot about? And if I'm behind the times, there are behavior analysts out there that are much more current on this than I am, because I'm more of an eclectic, broad-based, beg, borrow, and steal from multiple disciplines kind of guy. I'm not a dyed-in-the-wool behavior analyst, never claimed to be, and by now you've gotten the sense that I'm not, and I never will be, because that's not my sole or even primary orientation. Do we have a reasonably good understanding of the person's thoughts, beliefs, emotional state, feelings? Applied behavior analysis may tell us that feelings themselves are not behaviors. I can possibly agree with that. But man, do they profoundly affect the way people behave, as well as the emotional state. So these are contributing factors. We should be aware of these possible. Again, I'm not saying that any one of these in and of itself is going to be our core hypothesis, but we have to be looking at this really holistically, I believe, to come up with a hypothesis that's most accurate and relevant. Do these appear to be contributing factors to the target behaviors of concern? All right, let's go with poll question number 2, please, Marissa.
All right. So communication on some level is almost always a contributing factor when identifying the underlying functions of behavior. True or false? All right, you guys are moving very quickly, so thank you all for being on your toes. I am going to turn this off in about 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And just a reminder that if you did need CEU credit, that you did answer these poll questions, and that I will be analyzing all of this data for your CEU certificate, or your certificate tomorrow morning. You'll receive those instructions. So let's close this down, and it looks like, again, 99% said true, 1% said false.
We got that one holdout. I hope it's not the same person. Could be. Yeah, the answer is obviously true, because I just spent quite a bit of time saying how imperative it is that we consider communication and the person's abilities in that regard when we're developing our FBA and trying to formulate valid hypotheses as to why people do what they do. You know, questions? We got any questions, Marissa? I'm ahead of schedule, I think.
Yeah, there are a few questions. Let's go. We'll start for the questions that this time, and we'll go back to the ones from earlier later. So, amen. History is so important. What are your strategies for getting information when the record is bare? The new ISP in New Jersey leaves out everything except the most recent events.
Oh man, what a disaster. uh, you know, I find that usually if I can get in touch with an involved family member or guardian when I have nothing else to go on, and I can form a comfortable, confidential relationship with that person. Sometimes I can sit down with that person and do some kind of like a life history, a life interview of the person that we're evaluating, and get some really good information that way. Um, the problem with that, to be honest with you, sometimes is that people don't want to disclose. I'm just being honest again. I'm Mr. Honesty, I think, most of the time, although I can be dishonest once in a while. But, you know, a lot of family members that have been involved with an individual at some point earlier in their life may be aware of some abuse and neglect that they either allowed to happen or maybe they inflicted themselves. So there's a lot of guilt. People don't like to divulge family histories or psychiatric illness and disorders. They're ashamed. They're embarrassed. So I try to tell them, you know, I'm not here to shame anybody. You know, we've all got problems, but I only need to know this information because it's relevant as as to how and why I'm trying to help your loved one. So in the absence of having anything else, so New Jersey has got a lot of work to do. If all they're interested in is the here and now, good luck with that because they're sorely misguided. Sorry, New Jersey. You got anything else, Marissa?
Yes, there is another. Let's see. So with staffing and resource issues agencies suffer with, how do you address problem behavior that results of functional communication that cannot immediately be reinforced? For example, can't get attention or sit in a preferred area due to lack of staffing, the client not wanting to shower or cooperate with changing soiled clothes.
That's a very good question, and it's affecting all of us, right? Because the staff shortages are legendary. That's an understatement. So what I might do in that kind of a situation is I'm just throwing out an idea off the top of my head because I've had similar experiences. Maybe focus on teaching the individual to develop some appropriate coping mechanisms or waiting strategies because the response that they're looking for, they'd like to be instantaneous, but it can't be because we're either short staffed or someone whose needs require more immediate attention than yours. So in that case, I'd probably look at what can I think about creatively to, you know, more of a latency kind of thing. If I can build in that the person expects and acknowledges and is willing to build in a bit of a delay, you know, they're not going to wait forever. I don't expect them to. And then reinforce that and build in some incentive for that. That's that's how I would go about trying to address that issue, which I think is probably very common. It's a good question. They're always good questions from these guys. You got any more?
Yeah, there's another. Okay, so are you aware of any research or any other information that compares the reliability of indirect questionnaires over an FAI conducted in person with the AIM reporting for caregivers?
No, I'm not aware, but that's not to say it doesn't exist. That would be interesting. You know, one of the things, and again, I'm not ragging on the mass and the fast, which I use very frequently. But if you really look at those instruments, and I know that most of you have you noticed how when you're looking at the 4 or 5 core functions of behavior that they lead you to, you know, the escape, attention, tangible, sensory, automatic reinforcement, everybody eats that acronym. If you haven't heard that, EATS, EATS, might want to think about that. Remember that little tip. Um, a lot of those questions that you ask on those assessments are repetitive and they affect more than one category of behavior. So 5 out of 5 questions lead you to an attention hypothesis. I'm just throwing this out as an idea. But 3 of those 5 questions are related to escape avoidance. It always bothered me when I started to use those devices. I was like, wait a minute. And that's when I knew that they were somewhat flawed. I mean, just intuitively, like, well, how can the same questions yield the same or a different hypothesis. I don't get that. So no, I'm not aware of comparing and contrasting. If it's out there, I'm not aware of it. But as I said, the bane of my existence isn't always looking at the cutting edge research and behavioral analysis, because I tend to look at things from a much more eclectic, broad-based kind of approach. Any other questions? We can take one more maybe.
Okay, sure. Okay, so how do you get information on the client's thoughts, beliefs, emotional state, and feelings, especially when the client may not be able to, and the parents state that everything is fine and don't divulge the information?
You can't. The answer is you can't. That's a simple one. You can't. But why don't I try? My question is, why don't I ask them? Why don't we talk about what are your feelings when you get upset or angry? Now, this is presumably, again, you got to have a person of a certain functioning cognitive communicative level that's capable of doing this. But I work with a lot of people that can answer the questions I'm posing to you. Why aren't I at least? And I know I knew somebody was going to ask that, because you know what? A lot of people have asked me, well, what's the research on? Well, I don't know what it is, and I don't care. How's that? I hate to sound cavalier, but I really don't care, because I know as a human being who's been on the earth for 63 years that thoughts, feelings, and emotional states profoundly impact human behavior. Nobody has to prove it to me. Nobody has to give me compelling research. I know that as a person that has dealt with people and myself my entire life. So I at least should give that person the opportunity to divulge if they are able to identify and reveal some of those things. This question is absolutely correct, and that might be an option. And then we're back to speculation and conjecture, which of course we don't want to be, because we want to be as scientific in our approach as we can be. I get that, I respect that. But there may be individuals for whom those considerations are not applicable, or at least asking the person about those underlying expressions might not be possible. So I acknowledge that could be, it's not universal. You can't do it with everyone. But for those that can, we should at least get in there and make an effort, I think. Let's talk about external extraneous variables. And I'm just going to remind you that we have a full half hour at the end of the webinar, which is scheduled to go to answer questions. Well, I shouldn't say answer questions. I should say attempt to answer the question, because you guys always ask such damn good questions. Sometimes I simply can't answer them, at least not spontaneously in the moment. So let's talk about external and extraneous variables. We must attempt to identify any external variables, of which there are many, which may be contributing to the person's behavioral difficulties or challenges. And as an example, just think about the multitude of factors and variables that have impacted behavioral presentations, including our own, over the past 15 months due to the COVID pandemic, and all of the restrictions, changes, and deviations from normal routine, which have occurred as a direct result. My behavior changed profoundly over the last, it's getting back to normal, whatever that means. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad, but I think I'm getting back to my old self. Like I said, I don't know if that's good enough, but I can tell you this, I sure as hell know my behavior was changed in many, many ways. I experienced a lot of anger, uncertainty, trepidation, hostility, depression, all of those feelings and emotions that I experienced as a function of not being able to do all the things that I typically do, and had taken for granted for so long, I couldn't believe I couldn't do them anymore. That profoundly impacted my behavior, as it did virtually everybody we support. Because, you know, as many impositions as there were on me and the things I couldn't do, there were a hell of a lot more on the people living in 24-hour staffed residences. They couldn't see family members, they couldn't go out to eat, they couldn't, a lot of their day programs were suspended. Some of the damn day programs are still closed. I don't know when they're going to reopen, but I hope they do at some point. So you talk about major, profound changes that have impacted our behavior. Oh my God. So I'm just using COVID and the lockdown as an example of many external variables that we should attempt to identify. It's not just about the environment, what's going on in the moment, and nothing else matters, like apparently New Jersey would like us to think. That's not the way the real world operates. Haven't we all experienced significant personal behavioral changes over the past 1+ year? I just kind of articulated and elucidated that fact. We shouldn't be surprised that many of the individuals we support have also been affected in a similar manner. Now, what's amazing to me, and I'm sure to a lot of you, I work with multiple agencies and my caseload is pretty sizable, but I'm usually working in more of a peripheral capacity. I have known some individuals that got through this pandemic like it was a piece of cake. Can't believe how well they adjusted to these profound changes, these profound restrictions, these profound limitations. Can't believe how well they adapted and coped. I mean, I'm in awe. Like, why don't you give me some of that? Whatever you're doing, I want some of that because I'm not dealing with it like anywhere near as well as you are. And then I have other people, like many of you do, who have really had some very significant behavioral escalation over the course of the pandemic. Why? Well, I think because they're angry, they're frustrated, they're sick of it, like we all are. It's been very interesting to me to see the individual differences in how people have adapted and adjusted. Let me give you an example. So my experience, I deal with a lot of people with autism, like many of you do, or on the spectrum. So many people with autism, it's interesting to me. As soon as the pandemic hit and their day programs got canceled and they couldn't go home and they couldn't go out, they went off the deep end. Change in structure, routine, predictability, that's what people with autism flourish on. They need that kind of stuff. But what's amazing is after they knew their routine and the structure and the limitations had changed dramatically, they very rapidly adjusted. A number of them. I was like, well, this is amazing. I didn't expect that. I thought they were going to have problems throughout the duration, but it was only during the initial phases because staying home, you see, and not going to day program and not being able to go out became the new routine. And as it became more of the norm, they became more accepting of it. And because that was now the new normal. I just think I'm throwing that out there because I think it's an interesting observation based on, at least what I've seen and experienced in my practice. All right, let's talk about traditional functional hypotheses. And this is where I always get myself in trouble, but not to disappoint you, I'm going to do it again yet today. Of course, the most common underlying functions of behavior, according to applied behavior analysis. And like I said, there are many of you out there attending that are staying much more on top of ABA than I am. I stay on top of it, but it's not my life. I don't wake up every day and go to Java to see what the latest journal are. I don't do that. The most common underlying functions, and presumably, as far as I know, these are still the big ones, have to do with escape avoidance, attention, desire to obtain some type of tangible item or object, automatic reinforcement, sometimes referred to as sensory, and sometimes pain attenuation. So from my training, and I haven't been told otherwise, but maybe I'm behind the times, who knows, those were the basic primary core functions of why our folks do what they do. So having said that, I go to point number 2. I've never limited myself to these 4 or 5 functions. I haven't and I never will, because I don't believe those 4 or 5 functions are the only reason why people do what they do. And nobody will ever convince me of that. I've been on the earth way too long to think that everything can be plugged into one of those 4 or 5 hypotheses. No way in hell. If you want to believe it, that's fine. I'm not here to convince you otherwise. I'm just telling you from my perspective, I think that's very short-sighted. I do believe, and I'm saying here and acknowledging, I think they're a very good starting point for consideration. Absolutely. Attention, that's a big one. It's not why everybody does what they do, but it's a big one. So attention, the overwhelming number one hypothesis, should not be a major issue. Think about this for a minute. If attention is the primary reason why people do what they do and they live in a residence with reasonable staffing, and I understand we've had staff shortages, I get that, which support development of disabled adults, assuming, and I know it's an assumption, but these assumptions come before pre-pandemic and chronic major staff shortages. Assuming that the staff to client ratios are ample, which they typically are, again, pre-pandemic, then the issue is really about training staff and when to give attention and for what. We can fix that. This person brought up a very good question before. When there's a delay, person wants attention, needs assistance, needs support. They can't do something on their own. They're getting frustrated, they're getting angry, they're getting upset. Then we got to teach them to wait a little bit, because it's not always about them getting instantaneous response or gratification. Sometimes it's about waiting just a little bit and then providing whatever the assistance or support they need is, and then reinforcing the hell out of them for having waited even a reasonable period of time before we were able to provide that attention. So I want us all, including me, to think more along these lines. Everybody thinks when the attention hypothesis raises its ugly head, which it does all the time, people immediately think it's about more staff. We need more staff. We need a one-to-one. No, you don't. No, you don't. If you have 4 people living in a house, and the vast majority of time there's 3 staff on, minimally 2, you've got enough staff to be able to provide attention. But they have to understand the contingencies under which the attention is provided. And that's where the whole thing breaks down. Because the vast majority of our staff respond to our people when they're misbehaving. So they learn to get attention for all the wrong reasons. That may sound overly simplistic, but it happens to be true. So you may want to take a step back and think about that. Everywhere I go, we need more staff. We need more staff. No, you don't. You got staff tripping over each other. We got almost as many staff as we do people living here. What are we doing with the staff? How well trained are they? Do they know how to respond to challenging behavior in a way that doesn't reinforce or provide disproportionate amounts of attention, versus acknowledging all the opportunities in a given day to provide recognition, acknowledgement, attention for all the appropriate responsible things that our people do the vast majority of the time that we're supporting them? I want you to think about that, because I think there's a lot of truth in what I just said. Some of you may disagree. We'll see. Some of the hypotheses that I believe warrant further attention and consideration. These are my thoughts. I think an awful lot of our people have challenging, problematic, unacceptable, irresponsible behavior because they're bored to tears. That's what I think. So it's a response to boredom, inactivity, or gross understimulation. Try to convince me that this isn't a reasonable function of behavior, and I'll fight you. Because boy, do I see a lot of this. People are sitting around, not doing anything particularly productive, not involved in structured activities. They get bored, they get tired, they're understimulated, and then they start to engage in a whole repertoire, in some cases, of aberrant behaviors that we wish they wouldn't. Well, what the hell? They got nothing else to do. They got nothing else distracting them. They got nothing else they're thinking about. It also serves a communicative function. I'm bored, I'm understimulated. I'm not doing anything. So I believe that's a reasonable hypothesis. And if you ask me where's my research to back this up, I'll answer the question right now. I don't have any. Maybe at some point I will, but right now I don't. I'm just telling you what I think. A desire to control and manipulate the immediate environment. This is one I come across quite a bit, particularly with people with personality disorders. They want to control and manipulate the environment. They want to impose their will on the environment. And they do that via their behavior. They want people to leave the area, so they start to engage in a whole constellation of aberrant behaviors, dangerous behaviors, potentially dangerous behaviors, and everybody clears out. Good, I wanted you all to leave. I wanted you out of my space. Very effective way of doing it. So control and manipulation of the environment. Now, some of you, I'm going to take a liberty here. Some of you are probably already thinking about some of the newer hypotheses I'm talking about that I've experienced and trying to shoehorn them into one of those 4 or 5 categories. Don't do that. Don't do that because you're trying to force a fit that may not exist. Just accept that maybe some of these ideas have some merit. I have a couple of people that I believe their function of the behavior is because they're very angry, because it's a response to a level of supervision that the individual may find excessive, undesirable, or offensive. I have a few people, I can't be too specific because HIPAA and confidentiality laws, but I have a few people that once we decided they needed a much higher level of supervision, I'm talking like line of sight 24 hours a day, you're never out of my view. These are people that are used to being very independent and autonomous. I'm not going to get into what they did that warranted us to think that that was the right response, because I personally, I don't think it is in some cases. Their behavioral challenges went up exponentially. And I think in a couple of cases, at least, it's because they're really ticked off that they're never allowed to be alone. They never are out of sight. These are people that in some cases are used to having a lot of independent time, a lot of alone time. It's been taken away and they're not happy about it. So, and they're going to let us know it, and they do. So just be aware. Possible trauma-based response or reaction. Given a large percent of individuals that have experienced trauma, abuse, and neglect, and we know this is becoming more and more, we're becoming more and more aware of this, that can certainly play a role in the function of behavior and why people do what they do. So those are just some ideas that I have based on my own clinical experience that I believe absolutely have some merit and you might want to consider when you're doing your FBA. Now, I will tell you before we ask the last poll question that in addition to the PowerPoint presentation, which you're going to be able to have a copy of, I have included for all of you to have just a template of information, kind of a synopsis of what we've covered today, that I think we would be wise to have, at least by our side, as we're conducting our FBA. Have we looked at all of these potential issues and how they might be contributory to the function of the behavior and the formulation of our hypotheses? So I think a lot of times what we do is, and again, remember the title of today's presentation is not just going through the motions. If we're too quick about it, if we're not comprehensive enough about it, we end up with faulty hypotheses. Faulty hypothesis is a trial idea. It's not a fact. It's not set in stone, not 100%, not even close. It's a hypothesis. Hypotheses change. Maybe my hypothesis is wrong. Many times I've done FBAs and the primary function or hypothesis that I've come up with turns out to not be correct. Oh well, I make mistakes, we all do, that's fine. But go back and reconsider that your hypothesis might be faulty before you start making major modifications to the behavior support plan. And here's what sometimes happens. Ultimately developing a more restrictive behavior support plan because your hypotheses are incorrect. That's very unfortunate when that happens. Having said that, let's go to poll question number 3, please.
Okay, everyone. So we should always stick to the traditional hypotheses regarding function of behavior when conducting a comprehensive FBA. True or false? Alrighty, so I am going to turn this off in just a few seconds. You guys are running very, very quickly. Awesome. So 3, 2, and 1. Okay, so it looks like 6% said true and 94% said false.
So that 6% of the diehards that aren't going to accept that I have some additional hypotheses that I don't have any empirical or research support for, which is okay. I'm fine with that. That's fine. But I would hope that you'll consider some of these other possible functions, because I believe they're valid. I'm basing this on dealing with many, many people over many, many years. And just based on my current and past experiences, I think some of these things are in fact driving the behavior. That's all I got. I'm close to finishing on time, maybe a couple of minutes early. You never know. You never know when you never have done these webinars before, how close to an hour you're going to be. But according to it's 1:58, so we did pretty good. So I'm going to stick around, answer questions for the next half hour at least, if people have them. As many of you know, because many of you have reached out to me, which I always appreciate after these webinars are over, through my website, and have asked me very specific clinical questions about individuals you might be working with, ideas that I might have, and I'm always willing to take the time, and I have, and I'll continue to try to offer you at least my advice or my suggestions. I don't have all the answers, far from it, but I've been doing this a long time. I do have a lot of experience, and I might be able to give you some ideas that maybe you haven't come up with, or some creative solutions potentially for the folks that you support. So thank you again for your attendance today. I appreciate your time, and I look forward to some of you participating in the last webinar that's scheduled in August. Thank you again.
All right, everybody. So just wanted to again thank everybody for attending so far today. If you did need your CEU, then you did meet your CEU hour, so you are able to leave if you did not want to stay for the Q&A section. So I am going to just start from the very beginning of where we left off. So some of these questions are probably from the beginning of the webinar. So just be aware that if we didn't get there to your question, that we'll probably make our way to it. But okay, so oh, and just another note is that if you needed that CEU credit, is that I will have your instructions for your certificate for you by lunchtime tomorrow. So just keep that in mind as well. Okay, so if there is a significant mental health issue, bipolar or borderline personality disorder, how do you take that into consideration?
Well, let's say you have to know the behavioral manifestations of certain mental illnesses. So borderline personality disorder, some of the behavioral manifestations. I'm impatient. The world revolves around me. I don't have a lot of remorse. I don't really care about other people. I'm not trying to sound too callous here, but I'm giving you a quick overview. I don't really care about what other people are doing or what they're feeling or how my behavior impacts theirs. If you have a person with a mental illness and you have reason to believe that that mental illness diagnosis is valid, then what you should be doing in your FBA, I believe, is acknowledging your belief that the person has a bipolar disorder or a borderline personality disorder, and mentioning the contributing factors, contributing characteristics or symptoms of that, how that plays a role in your overall, remember this is a holistic document, in your overall summary of the behavioral functions. I see a lot of FBAs because I work with a lot of people that have a lot of mental illness. And it is very common for clinicians to write in their summary that, BPD, well, I shouldn't say that because that can be borderline or bipolar, but bipolar disorder or borderline personality disorder, or depression, or psychosis, or anxiety, or obsessive compulsive disorder, or all the other illnesses that are out there. If it's as verifiable as it can be, and the person is hopefully responding to some kind of psychopharmacology regimen that they might be on and you've seen improvement, that should be mentioned in the summary because mental illness can profoundly impact behavioral presentation. That's my best answer that I got for that.
Alrighty. So, how would you handle it? Was stuck in his or her opinion of the child's behavior? All information is subjective from this parent.
Yeah, read it to me again, please. You cut out the first part of that question.
Yeah, so how would you handle a parent who is stuck in his or her opinion of the child's behavior when all information is subjective from this parent?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because I noticed the person is using child, and I tend to work with adults 22 and older. Children are not my forte, and I'm not as knowledgeable, I think, in that area. But certainly, the subjectivity of parental. Don't you remember? I don't want to get into it because it's controversial, and I'll just get myself in trouble. But I always appreciate and acknowledge parental contributions regarding giving me background feedback and insight into their son or daughter's behavior, but I don't take it to the bank as fact because just as a function of their emotional attachment, the fact that they literally gave birth, assuming this is a biological parent, to their son or daughter skews their objectivity and their ability to look at things from a more unbiased perspective. So I think using parents as informants is always a very good idea, but I don't necessarily take all of the information because I understand the confounding factors there. I don't always take their information as either 100% accurate or 100% factual. That's the best I got on that one.
Alrighty. So, when completing an indirect questionnaire, who all would you have complete this form?
That's a damn good question too. Then why are all these questions so good and so difficult for me to answer? That one's pretty easy to answer. So here's what I usually do. I'm just telling you what I normally do, and I'm not saying it's not flawed because it is. If I have a manager, most group homes, living CLAs, support, whatever the hell you call it in your state, the old term is group homes, 24-hour staff supported living residences for people with disabilities. Let me call them group homes for a minute, and hopefully that doesn't offend anybody. So if I have a manager of a group home who's been there for a few to several years and has been working in that residence for that length of time, and I know through my experiences and associations with that manager that I think she's got a good insight and experience with the folks that she supports, that's usually my key point person for me. Let her be the primary informant. Now, here's what I've tried to do on a couple of occasions, and boy, this is pretty depressing. So, on a couple of occasions, I said, you know what? Instead of just the manager, let's assume the manager's only been there for a couple of months. So, what the hell does she know? So now I give the mash or the fast or something else, some other device, to 5 or 6 different staff, right? And say, guys, you've all worked with Joe for a couple of years at least. I want you to all fill these out independently and give them back to me. Wow, what an eye opener that can be, because the disparity among the responses can be pretty alarming. It's like, wow, you all work with the same guy and you're answering the question so differently. So I thought naively when I started to do that, it takes a little bit more work and time and energy. But I figured, hey, if I can get a collective response of 5 or 6 good informants to help me drive my hypotheses, that's fantastic. But most of the time, to be honest with you, they're all over the place. So it was an experiment that I've tried on multiple occasions, and most of the time it fails. So I'd say, find yourself a really solid, preferably longer term employee that you have confidence in their objectivity. They don't have preconceived notions. You don't have reason to believe that they do. That's usually a family member, of course, is welcome to fill it out as well. The more the merrier. I don't think, this This is a 2 or 3 page assessment. Why not have as many people weigh in as you can? The problem is when they all are saying something different. And then you want to try to condense that information to form your hypothesis. Good luck with that. Any more?
Yeah, all right. So, do you have suggestions for a way to reshape the conversation when staff say the individual is engaging in the behavior just for attention in a way that implies that asking for contact is somehow unreasonable?
Yeah, I usually, when I get a staff person, and I get it all the time, that say just that, I usually find that here's my approach. This has been crafted over a long period of time after I've gotten my brains beaten in by lots of staff when I try different approaches. When a staff person says that to me and approaches me from that perspective, the way I would immediately respond to that is, you might be right. A lot of the behavior that this person exhibits might be for attention, because we know there's a whole lot of people out there that do things for attention. But, let's try to gather some information together to support that is in fact the reason why the person is doing what they're doing. You may be right. You may be right. I'll give you that. But let's just go through this process together and see if there's other factors in addition to attention. Like I've said about most of my things in life, it's all in the approach. If you use that approach I just described, most staff, not all, some don't even want us involved because what the hell do we know? But most staff are gonna embrace your input and your involvement and maybe be slightly more open-minded. That's how I would go about it. Now, I'd like to know if it works or not. So send me an email.
All righty. So what do you think about remote FBA?
What does the person mean by remote FBA? What are they referring to? I need to know specifically. So I need more information. If they want to elaborate, I'll be happy to respond.
Okay. All right. So any tips on completing direct observation during COVID when we are staff and families instead of doing it ourselves?
Repeat the question again, please, Marissa.
Yeah, sure. So any tips on completing direct observation during COVID when we're directing staff and families instead of doing it ourselves?
Not really. I don't typically let other people do the observations, and I didn't even through COVID. I know not everybody can be as stubborn, as tenacious as I am, but I did a number of observations throughout the COVID period, usually from a distance, always with a mask, always checking my temp before I did them or gotten anywhere near close proximity to the person. My life didn't change that much during the pandemic as a clinician as a lot of people's did. And that's because I don't think there's any substitute for, and I'm not trying to sound pompous or arrogant, that's not the point here. I need to do my own observations. Thank you for your assistance. Thank you for being willing to do it for me. But what other people see is not necessarily what I'm going to see, because I've been trained differently. I have different types of experiences. So, I would hope now that things seem to be, again, normal being a relative word, now that things seem to be returning to normal, I would think the clinicians and the behavior analysts that are in attendance are now able to do more of this work correctly yourself, as opposed to relying on others to do it for you. I don't have any advice on how to do it during the pandemic other than I never liked it, I don't like it, and I'm not going to abdicate that responsibility to someone other than me.
Alrighty. So I treat young adults with HFA / Asperger's syndrome. I completely agree that ignoring inner thoughts as a factor in behavioral function is a mistake. I use an ABC model that includes thoughts similar to CBT, but more functionally based than traditional CBT. Do you have any other suggestions including inner thoughts while treating this population?
Not really. I think what this person is suggesting they're already doing is phenomenal. This is what I call an enlightened clinician, in my opinion, who understands the thoughts, feelings, behaviors, emotions, all of that constellation of stuff that makes us human. That when I did my ABA homework and coursework, again, over a decade ago, they really discouraged me from taking those things into account, which I think is a travesty. So I commend this person for understanding and acknowledging the contributory role that thoughts, feelings, and emotions play in behavioral presentation. But no, I don't have anything to add to what they're already doing, other than to commend them for what they're doing.
Alrighty. So how would you proceed with the FBA or even behavioral intervention when staff and parents are not able to provide data because there have been so many, or there have been no occurrences of problem behavior during the assessment process?
Well, we have to differentiate no occurrences during the assessment process versus no occurrences, period. Presumably, if you're doing a functional behavior assessment on a person, then there's a behavior that you're attempting to assess, unless I'm missing something here. So at some point, the person must have done something. The problem with all FBAs, as we know, this is well documented and well researched, is that if you have very low frequency of behavioral expression or presentation, then your hypotheses and your ability to accurately assess the conditions and what's driving that behavior is severely compromised. So it's good that the person is engaging in this behavior at a high rate. Presumably it's a behavior we would prefer the person not engage in, but it does compromise one's ability to be able to accurately assess what's driving it if it's not occurring. Then my next question would be, oh man, I'm in a dangerous mood today, Marissa. I'm going to warn you. My next thought, being the cynic that I am, is you don't have any data, but that doesn't mean it didn't exist. It just means your data sucks or nobody recorded it, right? That happens to me all the time. So now I got to try to get it. You say it hasn't happened, which may be true, but is it true? Because oftentimes it isn't true. That's the best I can do with that one.
Alrighty. So let's see. What examples of observable behaviors that fall outside of the four main function of behavior, and what are other possible functions of behavior you would suggest?
Well, I mentioned several of them in the webinar. The reason why applied behavior analysis, when I did the coursework, again, a while ago, wanted to discount thoughts, feelings, and emotions is precisely that reason, that they weren't directly observable. That doesn't mean they don't impact behavior. It doesn't mean they're not legitimate. It doesn't mean the person is profoundly influenced by their thoughts, feelings, and emotions. So the chasm, the gap here, is where the dyed-in-the-wool behavior analysts struggle with the thought of thoughts, feelings, and emotions being a contributory factor for exactly the reason that this person is articulating. We can't observe something that's an internal state. We can't observe a subjective emotion, right? Because only the person themselves knows what that is and if in fact they're experiencing it. So this is where I warned you, I'm not your traditional dyed-in-the-wool behavior analyst, never have been, never will be. This is where you have to be able to understand the contributions that those things are likely making. If the person is able to self-report, they are in fact having those thoughts, feelings, and emotions, rather than me being able to independently, objectively observe them, because by definition, thoughts, feelings, and emotions can't be, only the behavioral presentation driven by those thoughts, feelings, and emotions can be observed. It's a good observation. It's a struggle for many, including myself, but I have to acknowledge those contributing factors because they're real.
Alrighty. So wouldn't you consider boredom as a hypothesis falls under escape or avoidance function of behavior? Avoiding
No,
or escaping boredom? I don't.
no, no. Escape avoidance is what am I experiencing in the environment, in the atmosphere, in the moment that I want to get out of. The escape avoidance hypothesis is usually ascribed to people. I'll give you a couple of examples. Persons in a day program, they don't want to participate in the activity. They start acting out behaviorally. The staff say, okay, Joe, go over there and take a break, which is inadvertently reinforcing the escape avoidance, by the way, which a lot of us are guilty of doing. So that's escape avoidance. If I ask Johnny to clear the table and Johnny picks up the plate and he doesn't like clearing the dishes and bringing them to the sink, and he throws the plate against the wall and it smashes in 100 pieces, that's escape avoidance. How do you escape or avoid nothingness? I think it's understimulation. So no, I don't see understimulation, boredom, or inactivity as necessarily being equated to the escape avoidance hypothesis. I see that as a different function. I'm not saying that person is wrong. I'm just saying that's not how I view it. No.
Alrighty. So do you have any articles based on the other functions?
Absolutely none. How's that for an answer? I'm brutally honest, guys. When I don't have anything to support what I throw out there, I tell you. It's based on my experience, my working with hundreds and hundreds of people, talking with other clinicians over the span of the last 35 years. No, I don't have any empirical research to support. So having said that, if you want to, you can say, this guy's full of baloney. He's got nothing to back up what he thinks or says. I'm going to discount everything. You can do that. Yeah, that's fine. I won't hold it against you. I think that would not be a wise decision, but you can make of it what you will. So hard data, research, empirical evidence for some of my thoughts about what drives behavior and my additional hypotheses. No, I don't have it. I'm not even going to attempt to suggest that I do. Doesn't mean
Alrighty.
it's not valid. Just means I don't have backup.
Alrighty. So what level of detail to the information gathered during the FBA would you expect to be included in the FBA report?
The categories that are listed on the document that person will be able to obtain, I think tomorrow, that I've provided and along with this PowerPoint, I would suggest if you use that template because it focuses on health and medical factors, communication, life experiences, previous placements. It goes through the whole litany of different contributing factors that we've touched upon today in one cohesive, concise 2-page document. Those are the categories I think as a clinician attempting to do a comprehensive, hopefully accurate FBA, I would use that as a tool to guide me. I use it. I would suggest you use it.
Alrighty. So many organizations, including our services, are changing to more virtual options, including providing FBA and behavioral programming through virtual programs. Any suggestions on combating that?
No, but I hate this virtual stuff. I'll just put it out there. This telehealth crap that's going on is a joke. You have to be in a person's presence to be able to assess their behavior. Nobody will be able to convince me otherwise. I need to be in proximity to that person. I need to experience it. I need to feel it. I need to get an idea of the intensity. I need to get an idea of lots of things. And the only way I can do that is by being in the presence of that person. So though I'm not surprised that there's a whole movement to move away and do this virtual from a distance kind of analysis and assessment. It doesn't work for me. I'm old school. I'm going to fight it tooth and nail. The telehealth, talk to any therapist that's been doing telehealth counseling over the last year and a half during the pandemic, and they'll tell you it's a disaster if they're honest about it. I mean, they can still bill for it, but I don't think they should because it's garbage. And I shouldn't speak in such across. Most of the time, I don't believe people are benefiting from the virtual stuff as much as they do when we get in the trenches and do the work ourselves. I'm going to fight it because that's who I am. And I'm not going to change that. I'm way too old to change my personality or my ideas at this point. But I think a lot of the virtual stuff that people are coming out with now and suggesting is going to be how we move forward. That might have been a good stopgap during the pandemic. I would argue we didn't have a lot of alternatives. I had an individual the other day, I'm not making this up, who lives in a residence. I counsel him every week. He's one of the few that I counsel. And, we had to cut the session short. I won't forget this. His name is Chris. He's a very, very cool guy, very high functioning guy. And he says, we have to end our session a little early today. He said, why? He said, because I have a physical. I said, oh, your annual physical examination? He said, yeah. I said, oh, so you need to get to the doctor's office, right? Or something like that. He said, no, I just need to log onto the computer because, I have to hook up with the doctor. And I said, so the doctor's going to do a comprehensive physical on you without even having you in the same room, without putting his hands on you physically? Aren't there things they check for? And he was like, well, I don't know, but this is and it just struck me as funny. And I don't mean to sound condescending when I say that, but just to me, it was kind of funny. I'm like, wow, how do you do a physical of a person who's on a 15-inch computer screen? I don't get that. I still don't understand it. And nobody can tell me how they can do it. That's at the same level of thoroughness as physically examining the patient. I don't believe they're equivalent. All right, I went off on a tangent there on telehealth and virtual stuff. I apologize, but now you know how I feel about it.
Alrighty, so let's see. Do you use any form of functional analysis to when functional analysis is not inconclusive or is inconclusive? If so, how do you do that in real world environment of a group home?
So I have a confession to make. And if some of you that are still out there listening are on board with this, you're going to nod your head and we're all going to go to confession here. And here's the confession. I have never done a functional analysis. I've never done one. I've done hundreds of FBAs. I've never done a functional analysis. Why? Haven't had the resources, haven't had the need, haven't had the availability, haven't had the time. Those of us, here's what's scary. Do you know that there are some behavior analysts out there that don't know the difference between functional behavior assessment and functional analysis? Oh yeah, I've come across a lot of them. That's scary. So this person, I'm preaching to the choir, but a functional analysis is when you have an analog, experimental, controlled environment and you manipulate certain independent variables to see the response of the individual or the dependent variable that you're trying to assess or measure. And the thinking is that if you can control for all of the external factors and variables and do it in a very controlled setting, you're getting a purer, this is the thinking behind it. I'm not sure it's true, but the thinking is you're getting a more valid hypothesis as to what's driving the behavior, because you've attempted to account for many of the external factors and variables that you've taken out as a function of how you're conducting the assessment. I think that's a good overview of the difference between the two. Never done a functional analysis. Maybe I will at some point, but I'd have to go back and make sure I knew what the hell I was doing. Many behavior analysts have never done a functional analysis.
Alrighty. Well, everybody is wishing you, along with myself and everybody at BDS, is wishing you and your family and sending thoughts and condolences over for the loss of your father.
Thank you.
So sorry for that. and we wanted to thank you for doing this presentation for us today. And everybody who is still here, please go over and sign up for next month's session. More people are still writing in, sending their thoughts and prayers and condolences over for you, and sending so much love your way. Kevin, you're one of my favorite presenters. So so if you need anything at all, just to reach out to me. But everybody, please go sign up for next month's session. I believe it is here. Let's see. I don't remember which day it is. I believe it's the 17th of next month. So let's just verify that really quick. I'll give you the date. It is on the 19th. I'm sorry. It's on the 19th of next month, everybody. So join us from the 19th for the session. And please, as I said, your CEU certificate will be in your inbox by lunchtime tomorrow. So again, thanks all so much. And Kevin, thank you. And if you need
Thank you.
anything, give me a call or an email.
Appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
All right, everyone. Bye-bye.